Jasmine, a 23-year-old woman, had spent much of her young adulthood yearning for a meaningful relationship. She had grown tired of fleeting romances and shallow conversations. When she met Kevin, it felt as though her patience had finally been rewarded. Kevin, in his early 30s, exuded a charisma that was both magnetic and comforting. His self-assured demeanor and effortless charm made him the kind of man who could captivate a room without trying. He had a knack for making people feel seen and appreciated, and Jasmine was no exception. Their relationship progressed quickly, fueled by Kevin's attentiveness and Jasmine's desire for stability. He seemed to understand her on a deeper level, offering a balance of humor, warmth, and intelligence that made her feel secure. After only a few months of dating, Jasmine was certain she had found someone special. Wanting to take the next step, she decided it was time to introduce him to the most important person in her life, her mother, Diana. Diana was a 45-year-old woman whose resilience defined her. Raising Jasmine on her own had been no small feat, but she had done it with grace and determination. Her strong will and sharp instincts had carried her through years of hardship, shaping her into a woman who valued integrity and hard work above all else. Diana had always been protective of Jasmine, often acting as both mother and confidant. While she wanted her daughter to find happiness, she also approached new relationships with a cautious eye. When Kevin arrived at their first meeting, Diana's initial impression was favorable. He was well-dressed, polite, and carried himself with an air of confidence that she couldn't ignore. He spoke with ease, engaging both women in conversation that felt natural and genuine. Yet, as the evening progressed, Diana found herself questioning the authenticity of his charm. There was something about the way Kevin's compliments rolled off his tongue, too smooth, too rehearsed, that made her wary. Still, she chose to keep her concerns to herself, not wanting to dampen Jasmine's obvious excitement. As the weeks went by, Kevin became a regular presence in their lives. He often joined Jasmine for dinner at Diana's house, where his demeanor remained consistently warm and engaging. Diana couldn't deny that he had a way of putting people at ease. However, she began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior. Kevin would linger in the kitchen under the pretense of helping her clean up, engaging her in conversations that felt unusually personal. He would comment on her appearance in a way that bordered on inappropriate, offering compliments that seemed more suited to a romantic partner than a prospective son-in-law. Diana tried to dismiss these moments as harmless, attributing them to Kevin's outgoing personality. But her unease grew as his behavior became more deliberate. On one occasion, he offered to drive her home after a family outing, despite the fact that she hadn't asked for a ride. During the drive, his tone was casual, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward her in a way that made her uncomfortable. She found herself questioning whether she was imagining things, doubting her instincts despite years of trusting them. Kevin's attentiveness to Diana did not go unnoticed by Jasmine, but she interpreted it as a sign of his respect for her mother. To Jasmine, his willingness to go out of his way for Diana only reinforced her belief that Kevin was the real deal. She saw his actions as proof of his sincerity, not realizing that his charm was a carefully constructed facade. Diana, however, couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin's interest in her was more than just familial politeness. She noticed how his gaze lingered a moment too long during conversations, how his compliments seemed designed to elicit a reaction rather than express genuine admiration. Despite her misgivings, Diana felt trapped by the need to support Jasmine's happiness. She decided not to voice her concerns, hoping that time would prove her suspicions unfounded. As Kevin's visits became more frequent, Diana found herself increasingly uneasy. Her sharp instincts, honed over years of navigating challenges, told her that something was amiss. Yet she hesitated to act, fearing that any confrontation would strain her relationship with Jasmine. Little did she know, her silence would only serve to deepen the web of deceit that Kevin was quietly weaving around their lives. Diana's discomfort grew with each interaction. Kevin's gaze lingered on her a little too long, and his tone carried an undercurrent that she couldn't ignore. He began finding reasons to be alone with her, like stopping by unannounced when he knew Jasmine wouldn't be home, under the pretense of asking for advice or dropping off something Jasmine had forgotten. These encounters left Diana feeling cornered, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Kevin never crossed any explicit boundaries, but his presence felt calculated, as though he were testing how far he could push without raising alarm. Eventually, Diana decided she couldn't keep her concerns to herself. One evening, while Jasmine was at home, Diana brought up Kevin's behavior. She explained how his gestures made her uncomfortable and pointed out patterns that felt manipulative. She chose her words carefully, trying not to sound accusatory, but Jasmine's reaction was immediate and defensive. Jasmine accused her mother of being jealous and of trying to sabotage her happiness. The argument escalated quickly, with both women raising their voices and saying things they didn't mean. By the end of the confrontation, Diana was left feeling isolated and frustrated, while Jasmine stormed off, refusing to listen further. In the days that followed, the tension between mother and daughter grew palpable. Diana tried to maintain her distance from Kevin, avoiding situations where they might be alone together. Yet, Kevin seemed undeterred by her attempts to create boundaries. His behavior shifted from subtle to overt, leaving little doubt about his intentions. One evening, when Jasmine was out with friends, Kevin arrived unannounced. He carried himself with an air of confidence, his demeanor void of the usual pretense. He made it clear that he wasn't just interested in Diana as Jasmine's mother, he was drawn to her as a woman. Diana tried to push him away, firmly reminding him of his relationship with her daughter. However, Kevin's words were persuasive, carefully crafted to prey on her vulnerabilities. He spoke about the connection he felt with her, how he admired her strength and beauty, and how he couldn't ignore the feelings that had developed. Diana, caught off guard and emotionally drained from her strained relationship with Jasmine, found herself struggling to resist. Kevin's confidence was intoxicating, and for the first time in years, she felt seen and desired. The lines blurred further that night. Kevin's persistence wore down Diana's defenses, and her own feelings of loneliness and neglect began to cloud her judgment. She knew it was wrong, knew the betrayal it would represent, but in that moment, the need for validation overpowered her guilt. When Kevin kissed her, she didn't pull away. Their encounter spiraled into something neither could take back, culminating in a night that would shatter the fragile balance of their lives. As dawn approached, Diana sat alone in her bedroom, consumed by shame and regret. The reality of what had happened hit her with full force. She replayed the evening in her mind, wondering how she had allowed things to go so far. Meanwhile, Kevin showed no sign of remorse, casually slipping out of the house as though nothing had happened. For him, it was a victory, another conquest in a game he had been playing all along. For Diana, it was the beginning of a nightmare she couldn't escape. She knew that the truth would eventually come out and that the consequences would be devastating. The only question was when, and how much damage would be done in the process. Diana's life spiraled into chaos in the weeks following her night with Kevin. At first, she tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, burying her guilt beneath the routines of daily life. However, subtle but alarming changes in her body began to emerge. She felt a persistent fatigue that she couldn't shake, bouts of nausea that came without warning, and a nagging intuition that something was fundamentally different. The realization that she might be pregnant terrified her, and after days of denial, she bought a pregnancy test. The result confirmed her worst fears. The positive result felt like a death sentence to the fragile stability she had managed to maintain. Diana sat frozen, staring at the test for what felt like hours. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She was pregnant, and the child was Kevin's. The weight of this revelation was suffocating. She understood the consequences all too well. This wasn't just her secret, it was a bomb that could obliterate her relationship with Jasmine and destroy their already strained family dynamics. When Diana finally mustered the courage to tell Kevin, she hoped, despite everything, that he might step up and take some responsibility. But Kevin's reaction was far from what she expected. Instead of showing concern or remorse, he dismissed her fears with cold pragmatism. He insisted that the pregnancy had to remain a secret at all costs. His charm evaporated, replaced by a manipulative and controlling tone. He reminded her of the destruction that would follow if Jasmine ever found out. Diana's affair with him had already crossed the line, but the pregnancy made it catastrophic. Kevin's threats were thinly veiled, but effective. He made it clear that if she revealed the truth, she would lose everything: her daughter's trust, her community's respect, and her own sense of self-worth. Diana found herself trapped in a psychological prison. Every interaction with Kevin became a battle of wills. He alternated between subtle intimidation and empty reassurances, keeping her off balance. Meanwhile, the physical symptoms of her pregnancy became harder to hide. She grew more withdrawn, her once confident demeanor replaced by a quiet fragility. Her attempts to maintain distance from Kevin only seemed to provoke him further. He began showing up unannounced, using any excuse to remind her of his control. Each visit left her feeling more isolated and vulnerable. Jasmine, oblivious to the underlying tension, began to notice the changes in her mother. Diana, who had always been a source of strength and guidance, now seemed distracted and evasive. Jasmine's attempts to ask questions were met with vague answers or hurried deflections. At the same time, she noticed a subtle shift in Kevin's behavior. He had grown more assertive in their relationship, often making decisions without consulting her and spending less time discussing their future. The cracks in their relationship were forming, but Jasmine couldn't yet see the full picture. The pressure of keeping the pregnancy a secret weighed heavily on Diana. Every time she looked at Jasmine, she felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. She wanted to come clean, to explain the circumstances and beg for forgiveness, but Kevin's threats loomed over her like a dark cloud. She began avoiding Jasmine altogether, retreating to her room or finding excuses to leave the house when they were alone together. Jasmine, feeling the growing distance, started to suspect that something was wrong. Her questions became more direct, but Diana deflected them with increasing desperation. Kevin, sensing that Diana was on the verge of breaking, tightened his grip. He began calling her late at night, his tone shifting between seductive and menacing. He reminded her that she had more to lose than he did and that any attempt to expose him would backfire. Diana felt the walls closing in, her options dwindling with each passing day. The pregnancy, which should have been a source of hope and new beginnings, became a symbol of her deepest shame and regret. The once strong bond between Diana and Jasmine continued to erode. Jasmine interpreted her mother's behavior as disapproval of her relationship with Kevin, fueling resentment that made their conversations strained and hostile. Diana's silence, born of fear and guilt, only deepened the divide. Meanwhile, Kevin played both sides masterfully, maintaining his facade of a caring boyfriend while manipulating Diana behind the scenes. His ability to control the narrative left Diana feeling powerless, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the weeks turned into months, Diana's isolation became unbearable. She knew that the secret couldn't be kept forever, but the thought of the fallout paralyzed her. Every time she thought about coming clean, Kevin's threats echoed in her mind. The weight of the pregnancy, both literal and figurative, pressed down on her with relentless intensity. She was living on borrowed time, and the inevitability of the truth's revelation loomed closer with each passing day. The question was no longer if the secret would come out, but when, and what the cost would be. Jasmine returned home earlier than expected one morning, a day that began unremarkably but quickly unraveled into chaos. The house was unusually quiet when she walked in, and the air carried an odd tension that made her pause. She instinctively moved toward the living room, where muffled voices drifted from the other side of the door. As she pushed it open, the scene before her froze her in place. Kevin and Diana were standing too close, their body language unmistakable. Kevin's hand lingered on Diana's arm, and the expression on both their faces revealed far more than words could. It was a moment that shattered everything Jasmine believed about the two people she trusted most. Jasmine's shock quickly gave way to anger. She demanded answers, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Diana, caught off guard and cornered, struggled to find the words. The weight of weeks of guilt and secrecy pressed down on her, and she finally broke. She tried to explain, haltingly recounting what had happened, including her pregnancy. But instead of softening Jasmine's anger, the confession only intensified it. Jasmine felt blindsided, betrayed not just by Kevin, but by her own mother. She accused Diana of destroying their family and undermining everything she had worked to build with Kevin. Unable to process the revelation, Jasmine stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her and leaving Diana and Kevin alone in the fallout. The silence that followed Jasmine's departure was heavy and suffocating. Kevin, unshaken by the confrontation, turned to Diana with a calculated calm. He insisted that they could fix this, his tone devoid of any real remorse. He portrayed himself as the victim of circumstance, claiming that everything that had happened was beyond his control. But Diana saw through his facade for the first time. His confidence, once alluring, now felt sinister. She realized that he was a manipulator who had used her vulnerability for his own gain, and his lack of genuine concern for the damage he had caused filled her with disgust. Diana's revulsion grew as Kevin shifted from reassurance to subtle threats. He reminded her of the consequences of revealing the full truth to Jasmine or anyone else. He pointed out the scandal her pregnancy would cause, how it would ruin her reputation and sever her ties with her daughter permanently. His words carried an edge that left no doubt, if Diana tried to end things or expose him, he would retaliate. Kevin's ability to control the narrative and his willingness to use Diana's fears against her left her feeling trapped once again. But this time, something shifted within Diana. The realization that Kevin was willing to destroy her and her daughter's lives to protect himself ignited a spark of defiance. She saw him for what he truly was, a dangerous opportunist who thrived on manipulation. The guilt she had carried for weeks was now joined by a simmering anger, not just at Kevin, but at herself for allowing him to wield so much power over her. She resolved to end the cycle, no matter the cost. Kevin, sensing her resolve, doubled down on his threats. He warned her that if she didn't fall back in line, he would ensure that everyone in their community knew about her betrayal and her pregnancy. Diana, however, was no longer willing to let fear dictate her actions. She knew that confronting him would come with risks, but the alternative, continuing to let him control her, was no longer an option. The tension between them reached a breaking point as Diana made her decision. She told Kevin in no uncertain terms that their relationship was over and that she wanted him out of her life. Kevin's reaction was cold and calculating, but he didn't push back immediately. Instead, he left the house with a parting warning, promising that she would regret crossing him. As he walked out the door, Diana felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the looming threat of his retaliation. Left alone in the aftermath, Diana knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Jasmine's anger and sense of betrayal would take time to heal, if they ever could. Kevin's threats lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of the precarious position she was in. Yet, for the first time in weeks, Diana felt a glimmer of strength. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and while the path forward was uncertain, she was determined to face whatever came next with courage. The fight was far from over, but Diana was no longer willing to let Kevin dictate the terms. Diana had spent sleepless nights deliberating on how to put an end to Kevin's threats and manipulations. She knew that avoiding him or hoping he would disappear was futile. The stakes were too high, her relationship with Jasmine was already in tatters, and Kevin's hold over her was a constant threat to her remaining sanity. Determined to take control of the situation, she contacted him and arranged a meeting. The location she chose was deliberate, an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. It was a place she remembered from her younger years, isolated and suffused with an eerie quiet. When Kevin arrived, he carried himself with his usual confidence, parking his car haphazardly and strolling into the house as though he owned the place. Diana was already inside, waiting in the dimly lit living room. She had cleared the space of debris, creating a small area where they could talk. But she wasn't naive enough to believe this would end peacefully. Tucked discreetly under the table was a kitchen knife she had brought with her, a precaution she hoped she wouldn't have to use. The conversation began tensely, with Diana attempting to reason with him. She made it clear that she wanted him out of her life and demanded that he leave Jasmine alone as well. Kevin, however, was unmoved. He dismissed her words with a smirk, leaning casually against the doorframe. His tone was patronizing as he reminded her of the leverage he held over her. He reiterated his threats, emphasizing the ruin he could bring to her reputation and her family if she defied him. As the discussion escalated, Kevin's true nature came to the forefront. His voice grew sharper, his words more venomous. He began to taunt Diana, accusing her of being weak and foolish to think she could outmaneuver him. When she insisted that Jasmine needed to be protected from him, Kevin's demeanor darkened. He hinted at using Jasmine against her, a veiled threat that sent a chill down Diana's spine. It was at that moment she realized the extent of his depravity. Kevin wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything she held dear. Diana's fears turned to anger. She stood her ground, raising her voice to match his. Kevin, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, stepped closer to her, his movements calculated and intimidating. He sneered as he mocked her attempts to fight back, daring her to do something about it. His confidence was unnerving, but it also fueled Diana's resolve. She reached for the knife, her hand trembling but determined. Kevin laughed when he saw the blade, clearly unimpressed by the threat. He took a step closer, his expression one of mockery and disbelief. To him, Diana was no match, just another person he could manipulate and control. But as he moved within arm's reach, Diana's panic overtook her. In a blur of fear and adrenaline, she lashed out, the knife striking its target. Kevin stumbled back, his smirk replaced by a look of shock. He clutched his abdomen as blood seeped through his shirt, his confidence evaporating in an instant. He staggered, his legs giving way as he collapsed onto the floor. Diana stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, her mind reeling from what she had just done. The room was silent except for Kevin's labored breathing, which grew weaker with each passing moment. As the reality of the situation set in, Diana dropped the knife and grabbed her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, her voice barely audible as she reported the incident. She stayed on the line until the police arrived, her gaze fixed on Kevin's motionless body. When the officers entered the house, she offered no resistance, her movements slow and deliberate as she surrendered herself. She told them everything, about the affair, the pregnancy, and the threats. She held nothing back, knowing that the truth was her only option now. Kevin was pronounced dead at the scene, and Diana was taken into custody. At the police station, she sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room, her mind replaying the events over and over. She felt numb, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had acted out of fear and desperation, but the consequences were inescapable. When Jasmine learned of what had happened, she was devastated. The news of Kevin's death, combined with the revelation of his betrayal and her mother's actions, left her overwhelmed with grief and confusion. She struggled to reconcile the image of the mother she had always known with the events that had unfolded. Despite her anger and heartbreak, a part of her understood that Diana's actions had been driven by a desire to protect her. Diana sat alone in her prison cell, the walls around her a stark reminder of the life she had lost. She clutched a small photograph of her and Jasmine, taken years ago during happier times. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat in her own home, holding the same photo, tears streaming down her face as she grappled with the complexity of her emotions. Both women were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, knowing that the path to healing would be long and uncertain.